Hi, everyone. Before I get to the episode, I want to take a moment to address the United States Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade on June 24th, which stripped away the right to have a safe and legal abortion. Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all people, which we have already seen with abortion bans and restrictions in countries like Poland and Malta. This decision has dire consequences and could have harsh repercussions for other landmark decisions within the United States. I encourage our audience, American and otherwise, to learn more about what you can do to help at podvoices.help. I encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word.
Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your host, Maricella Herrera.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Ellevate podcast. I know mine is not the voice that you are used to hearing right off the bat. It's producer Megan here. I am just coming in to say that we have a super special episode for you guys today. So, as I'm sure many of you all know, McKinsey and Company's annual report, Women in the Workplace, just released its 2022 version. It is the report about women's experiences in the workplace. It's just incredible data that I know Ellevate loves, but I don't know anyone who doesn't use this report, who doesn't follow this report, and just to see the status of women in the workplace. So the 2022 edition of it just came out, and we actually got the chance to talk to Rachel Thomas, the co-founder and CEO of leanin.org, and Alexis Krivkovich, the co-founding author of the report. And we got a chance to sit down and talk to them just all about the report, about the data that's in it, about what changes have happened this year, about the changes women are experiencing in the workplace. And it is so incredible. So get ready for an amazing conversation between Maricella, Rachel, and Alexis. If you're following this report, if you're not following this report, definitely be sure to give this a listen and definitely be sure to check it out because this has really become the gold standard for women in the workplace. Without further ado, let's go ahead and cut to that interview now.
So very excited today to be here with Alexis Krivkovich and Rachel Thomas. Alexis is from McKinsey. Rachel is the co-founder of Lean In, and you all work together to put out the McKinsey and Lean In Women in the Workplace report, which has been going out for the last 8 years. And the last one just came out yesterday, which is very exciting. I wait for that report every year, by the way.
Oh, that's so nice to hear.
It is nice to hear.
What trends have you seen over the last 8 years that have kind of been eye-opening to you?
The biggest thing we're seeing this year is we're in the midst of a great breakup. Women are just as ambitious as men in leadership, but they're leaving their companies at the highest rate we've ever seen and at a much higher rate than men. And here's why this matters. We know women are already dramatically underrepresented in leadership, and now companies are losing the few women leaders they do have. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem, for every woman director who gets promoted, 2 women directors are choosing to leave their company. So that's 1 up and 2 out.
That's big.
That is big, and that's our message this year is companies really need to pay attention to it. They have a big pipeline problem.
So I want to touch on 2 things here. First, I love the term the great breakup because we've talked about the great resignation, the great reshuffle, the great everything. But breakup, I think, goes to the heart of it because there's this dissatisfaction, right, that's driving this.
Yeah, I think that's such a great piece to pause on for a moment because they're not leaving the workforce, they're just leaving you. And I think companies need to keep that in mind, right? That this is the moment where women leaders who we've long known disproportionately show up in the workplace, like the type of leaders that companies want to see. They do twice the sponsorship. They cover the majority of the DE&I objectives. They check in with employees more on workplace well-being, on balance, on workload. So they are strong critical leaders. But 75% of companies admit they don't reward that stuff formally. And so now you've got women leaders saying, wait a minute, like, what's the ROI? What's the return on this extra investment I'm making? And if I don't feel like I see it here, I'll go somewhere else to get it.
I love it. It's not here it is. It's not me. It's you.
Mm-hmm.
It's very clear.
Yes.
That's right. And I think if you put the positive spin on it, what it says is companies that are getting this right, that have a track record of strong promotion, equitably of talent, all types of talent, including their diverse talent, they're going to win, right? And they're going to be the places that attract these women because they're not exiting the workforce entirely. Importantly, they're seeking out a better experience, a fairer experience, and one that matches the effort they're putting in.
Yeah, and to Alexis's earlier point, they're going to win attracting and retaining these amazing women leaders, the very leaders that are doing more to invest in employee well-being. They're doing more to advance diversity, equity, inclusion. As Alexis said, they're more likely to sponsor other employees, are more likely to show up as allies in the workplace. So they're going to be attracting the very talent they need to really move into the future of the workplace and create a culture that works for everybody. So all ships will rise if organizations can figure out how to hold on to those precious women leaders.
My God, you are talking my language here. This is so exciting because I'm also like, to me, I hear a lot about how women are just leaving, or minorities too, to be honest. And my question is, but if we're all leaving, how are things going to change? But you're right. We're going to places that value us, and therefore the tide will lift all boats. I want to go back to something Rachel said at the beginning, which was, it's not that we're not ambitious. I've read so many articles recently and so many comments on women are less ambitious now that they were in the past.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's in fact, what we see is the opposite. So women remain as ambitious as men in wanting the next promotion. What they don't want is the top jobs, the way the top jobs are defined today with all the constraints surrounding them. And one of the issues about the top jobs today is 3 out of every 4 of them in the C-suite is held by a man. 19 out of every 20 is held by someone who's not a woman of color. And so you don't have representation today in leadership that looks like the breadth and the diversity of profiles of what great leadership can look like. And so you have this disconnect where women are highly ambitious. And in fact, what we see is women under 30, their ambition has grown through COVID. They're even more ambitious than they've ever been before, but they have an expectation about where they want to put that ambition. And I think they're rightly challenging the pretty narrow, confined way we've historically defined what those roles need to look like in order for people to succeed.
What do you think are they looking for more if they are to look at a top job, for example?
So the same things that women in leadership are prioritizing, young women are prioritizing too, right? They want to work for organizations where they see opportunity. And we know that in many organizations, women still receive more signals that it's going to be hard for them to advance. Yeah. Just one of 100 facts we could share with you is that women leaders are twice as likely to be mistaken for someone more junior than men leaders. And so women are going through the workplace and receiving these signals that it's going to be harder. So it's not surprising they want to go to workplaces where they don't think they're going to receive as many of those signals, workplaces that are incredibly invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. The other thing that we know is that they place a higher premium on flexibility. And this is likely because women tend to be doing more at home, working that double shift. And also, we would argue they're doing more at work. And then finally, they are deeply committed to employee well-being and to diversity and inclusion, and they expect their companies to be committed to it as well. So you see that for women leaders, and you especially see it for young women, these rising women leaders. All of these things are even more important to them.
Yeah, it's, and you put it in the day-to-day context and you just think it's easy in the data to sort of dismiss away some of these things. Like it's not a big deal but if you've worked so hard to get into the room
Mm-hmm.
and to earn your equal spot there, and then someone asks you if you're going to bring the coffee or if you're going to take notes for everybody. Or I had a colleague who was in a meeting the other day, really important high stakes meeting. And someone turned to her and said, "I'm surprised you've been able to be this successful given you look like a little girl."
Oh my God, that's not even a
You're sitting
microaggression.
there going, "Wait, what?" And it sits out there, these moments, and they're like the fractional stuff that I don't know a man who's ever had to grapple with that and then turn around and crush it. Right? And women have those experiences all the time. They say something, then, someone sitting next to them says the same thing and it's attributed to the other person. And this happens in particular, this happens with very high frequency for women of color. And the degree to which they describe these experiences, these micro moments in the workplace. And I think one of the most fascinating things as a result is that women of color, women with disabilities, LGBTQ plus talent, they describe a better workplace now that there's more hybrid and more remote in it, in part because they don't face these micro moments that are so discouraging and undermining.
Yeah. And just building on what Alexis said, all women are experiencing these undermining microaggressions that kind of get at your competence and that can really slow you down. I mean, Alexis told one story, and we could spend the rest of this podcast telling stories about things that we've heard that have kind of knocked us, off our ground for a moment. But we know that for women of color, LGBTQ plus women, women with disabilities, they actually start to veer into being fully disrespectful and othering. For example, those groups of women are more likely to be criticized for their demeanor, to hear comments like you look mad or you should smile more. They're more likely to have coworkers comment on their appearance in a way that makes them feel
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable. And so, one of the things, microaggressions is the term that's used to describe these slights or cuts. But I've had so many women of color and, women with traditionally marginalized identities say microaggressions, macroaggressions. And I think that that is a point worth pausing on, regardless. They add up regardless of who you are, and depending on your identity, they actually hit pretty hard. And it's hard to be your best self. It's hard to show up in the workplace when you're experiencing them on a regular basis. And yet, despite all of that, we know that women of color are actually more ambitious than white
Mm-hmm.
women. And so, one of our messages for years has been, if you want to get more women in leadership in your organization, you should be doubling and tripling down on supporting and advancing women of color and other women with traditionally marginalized identities. These women are ambitious despite the extra headwinds.
And yet they're the ones that are being left behind the most.
That is exactly right. If you look in the pipeline year over year, and I'll talk about women of color because that's the pipeline data we have, but women of color are advancing more slowly than white women and more slowly than men of color. So as a result, when you get to the C-suite in organizations, only 1 in 5 C-suite leaders is a woman, but only 1 in 20 is a woman of color, and we need to change that.
We absolutely need to change that. And I understand the death by 1,000 cuts of microaggressions. I always write about how uh, I'm an emotional Latina, according to people, but it gets hard. Of course, people want to leave. Do you think so? I know you've talked about in the reports in the past and in this year as well about the broken rung. Is that um, also, I'm assuming, much more pronounced for minorities?
It is, although I think if there's a bit of a bright spot in the data, we've seen over the past 2 years that it's closing
Okay.
in. And I think that's something to, to point out because it suggests that companies are starting to put the attention that's very necessary and very deserved for not just talent in general or women and men, but really all forms of diversity, and in particular the experiences of intersectionality, like Rachel was talking about.
Yeah.
So what you see, though, overall, is that the broken rung is really persistent. Right, for every 100 men who moves forward, only 87 women do, and 82 women of color. Now, a couple of years ago, that number for women of color, if you were a Black woman, it was more like 56. So, you know, great that we're moving our way in the right direction, but still these numbers 82, 87 to 100, they may feel small, but we're talking about, the very first step up to manager. I mean, this is the moment you typically see a bigger paycheck, you get a mandate that's larger. These are jobs that parlay into other bigger opportunities, and to be leaving that many women behind, that many women of color behind, means you set up a pathway you can really never recover from. And that's what we see with most companies, right? If they start off behind, they never regain that ground.
And by the way, this is the second pipeline problem. We've talked about women leaders leaving at a higher rate than men leaders. And on top of that, most organizations have this broken rung. So that means you're advancing fewer women into leadership, and now you're losing more women in leadership. And companies have worked hard over the last 10 years. The progress has been slower than I would like, and I think all of us here today talking would like, but they have made progress on gender equity. But if they don't address these two areas of the broken rung, that progress is really going to unwind.
That's really true. How, for years and years, I think back in the day, you would always hear the problem of the pipeline of people coming into the workforce. And now it's really not women coming in to to companies, but actually being promoted into management roles, leadership roles, and then leaving. And I do want to come back to specifically the management part, because in your report you do say that managers play an essential role in shaping women's and all of the employees' experiences, which I truly believe, and this is something that I wholeheartedly think managers make or break culture. So if we are having less women come into these roles, what's that impact going to be in the culture of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly the right question, right? When you think about when people leave a company, they're really leaving their manager, because you experience a lot more in your day to day by the person who manages and oversees your work than you do by what's happening up in the C-suite, particularly if you're not close to that level and you're early in your career. And the reality is there's a growing gap between what's expected of managers and how they're being trained and rewarded, right? So most companies will admit that, I mean, 80%, right, will say, I'm asking more than I was 2 years ago. I want my manager to check in on well-being. I want them to help support advancement. I want them to promote inclusion and diversity on their teams. But less than half of all manager trainings even cover these topics, right? And most managers say, I don't even know where to begin on a lot of this. And so it's not surprising that all talent says, wait a minute, I don't see these things happening day to day, right? There's a huge disconnect between what the company says they're asking their manager to do and what the average individual says they experience from their manager. And, if you're a woman who already faces these other headwinds we just talked about, having a manager show interest in your career, help with your workload, encourage respectful behavior from others, that stuff matters a ton. But less than half of women will say that they see that their manager doing those types of activities on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's a ton here to unlock in getting managers set up for success. And truly, you get it right, you'll not only help your women attrition challenge, you're going to help all your talent really rise.
Yeah, and it's interesting, 80% saying that they're asking them to do more, because and the more comes from all of these cultural aspect, like more about business culture. It comes about from the DEI, from checking in on wellness, from checking in their advancement, and that's, most managers are just thrown in without a map. Just go.
Well, and the great irony is in a lot of companies, the way you get the job of manager is because you were really good at doing the job before, which probably means you got some of the least coaching along the way. And so the chances that you actually already know how to coach people from all different backgrounds, all different experiences, who need support on all these new things that you were never asked about before is just, it's magical thinking.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the whole effect of management, and you do mention about performance review and how a lot of these extra things, not even extra things, because honestly I do believe that, team morale, employee retention, they're all part of your role as a manager. um, but they're not taking account into if they're not taking account into your performance review, then if they're not measured, how much do you really put into them?
That's exactly right. We know this, that in most organizations, what gets measured and what gets rewarded is what gets done. And so, one of the really telling findings from this year is almost all companies, 93%, they look at business goals and business metrics when they're evaluating their managers. Of course, they do. That makes sense. But they're not looking at metrics linked to employee well-being and diversity, equity, inclusion. They're not looking at employee morale. They're not looking at employee retention, a sense of belonging on teams. And that really matters. That matters because, as Alexis unpacked so beautifully, we need our managers to be showing up differently. And that's not an indictment of managers. That's a message to companies. They need to do more to set them up for success and give them the wherewithal to really show up as the demands of being a good manager have changed, particularly as we're switching to more and more flexible work and people are not even all in the office together. And then the other thing that's going to be great if companies actually start to build these metrics into performance reviews, who is that going to end up recognizing? It's going to end up recognizing disproportionately the women managers who are already doing this. So that's going to lead to more money for them, more advancement to them. And I think companies are going to have a better chance of holding on to them if they start to reward that important and critical work that often goes unrecognized.
Absolutely. I want to go back a little bit to the flexibility in hybrid work, because you're saying, women, the hybrid work and flexibility, game changers for women. But there has been this like kind of debate, and maybe it's quieted down a little bit, of will that hybrid work, which will be taken advantage of, this flexibility to work remotely by more women and minorities who actually will benefit a lot from him, will that impact them in terms of their visibility and therefore in terms of their potential for growing in their careers?
Yeah, it's a really important point to think through, because there's certainly that risk there that you create a new community of difference,
Mm-hmm.
that's built about who's in and getting FaceTime, who's out, and not getting the physical FaceTime. I think it's worth starting though with the recognition that everyone wants to see more flex in the future workplace. That doesn't mean an entirely remote world, right? But in many cases, it means more incorporation of virtual hybrid models than we had pre-pandemic. The vast majority of employees, men and women, want to see that.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, most companies that we surveyed said they don't anticipate going all the way back. In fact,
Good.
only 7% said they were headed into a mode of trying to get everybody, back into the office the way it was before the pandemic. So, our sense here is that there's something about how do you take the bright spot from this forced experiment around, hybrid and remote work, and incorporate that into a future value proposition that is appealing to all employees, but is particularly valuable to women and individuals of color because the workplace they experienced before wasn't as positive for them,
Yeah.
right? The number one thing women said they wanted to see more of before the pandemic was greater flex in the model. And so, my anticipation is that what you're going to see is something where we land somewhere where we take the best of that, and create that and make that available to employees without the expectation that that means we move all the way into a virtual world.
That makes sense. And there are many, many, many good things about flex work and hybrid work. I'm a fan. Was there anything specific that surprised you like you, either of you, in the report this year?
It goes back to this conversation around flexibility. And I couldn't agree with Alexis more. I think for many companies, it's not going to be 100% remote. Um, but that 1 in 10 women only want to work mostly on site. I think that's really telling. And as we already discussed, it's not just about flexibility. It actually is delivering a better day to day work experience for them. But that makes me also want to step back and really pause, and because that is really pointing to that the culture of work overall needs to improve, right? Like, we don't want a workplace where working from home is markedly better because you experience fewer microaggressions and you feel more psychological safety. Right? We want a workplace where, regardless of where you work, a coffee shop, your kitchen table, or at a desk in an office place, that you feel respected, valued, included. So I think it really speaks to, at the same time, companies need to be focusing on how to get flexibility to work for everyone. So those that are remote or hybrid, and they're more likely to be women, are not penalized. They don't face flexibility stigma, which we know is, alive and real. That's one thing companies really need to be thinking about, but they also just need to be continuing to invest in making the culture of work better for everyone. So we get to a workplace where, regardless of where you're working, when you're working, you're judged or evaluated based on results, and that you feel like you belong and you feel like you're welcome. And so that really is the future of the workplace. And what's exciting is, I think, as companies continue to navigate this big seismic shift towards flexibility, it's forcing the intentionality, the creativity, the trial and error that I think is actually just going to get us to a better workplace overall.
Rachel, you just blew my mind, because I think we tend to think a lot about flexibility because of the benefits of caregiving or being at home or whatever. But when you look at the numbers, like you guys have, and like look at the number of microaggressions and look at those data points about how othering the experiences can be, or how bad the day-to-day work environment can be, you're right. We have to change the culture. It has to become a place of inclusion and belonging. It's just a different way to look at flexibility.
Yeah, that's right. And for all employees, regardless of where and when they're working. And that is literally the future of work. And I think what happened is we glimpsed what that could be like during the pandemic, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what you're seeing is all employees, but particularly women employees, saying, we don't want to go back. We're not going to return to business as usual. And I think that's what's really fundamentally driving the great breakup.
What can women, and we talked about young women, so we can say specifically them, how can they make their voices heard? And particularly when we're talking about this environment of work right now.
Well, one thing is really vote with your feet and think about where you want to put that high octane energy you have in your career towards a company that's going to reward you for those efforts and those that have a track record. I think increasingly young women are going to look at leadership levels as they're evaluating the companies they consider and say, you talk about the importance of diversity. Do I see it in your numbers? You talk about how much you value inclusion. Do I hear that from the employees who work for you? And one of the most exciting things for me this year in the findings has been the degree to which some of the actions around diversity and inclusion that we saw a few years ago are really becoming table stakes, meaning the vast majority of companies have put practices in place, and that companies that are leading on measures of diversity, both women and women of color, are disproportionately now leaning forward on a number of other practices that used to be considered, maybe experimental and are now clearly associated with those who are breaking away and out in front. And these are things like, I don't just do bias training, I actually have mechanisms to interrupt it in the moments that matter when we're having decision meetings about talent. Right? I don't just talk about and track measures of diversity. I create accountability in my leadership. I put teeth behind it. And so you can't join an organization and in your first 5 weeks go influence those policies, but you can increasingly, one, choose companies where you hear them talking in specifics about the actions they're taking, not just in principle about how important diversity is. And two, be asking your leadership, do you see these types of steps being taken? Are they looking at the research? Are they innovating consistently? Are they reflecting on the culture of the workplace they've created and trying to improve it every single day?
What would be, in your opinion, the number one thing a company could do to improve or fix some of these issues?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, two things come to mind for me, but let me step back in that, I agree with Alexis's larger point that from a 10,000-foot perspective, companies need to move beyond the basics
Mm-hmm.
and just start pushing, right? Forging new ground, trying different things, and moving from, a single intervention or, a one-time training to really figuring out how to get their commitment to employee well-being and diversity, equity, and inclusion and their policies to really make sure that they're fully integrated into the day-to-day of work. That said, two things I think organizations should really focus on. One, fix your broken rung. My guess is if it's at the manager level in most organizations, but if it's even at another level, a little bit higher up, find that broken rung and really make sure that promotions are equitable. Monitor the outcomes, make sure they are. And if they're not, root out the biased aspects of your process and make sure that women are also being put up for promotion and getting the same opportunities at the same rates. And then the other thing that we already talked about is managers are on the front lines of all this. I think organizations rise and fall based on how their managers are showing up. So make sure, it's not just expectations of managers that are rising, training's getting better, managers are getting the support they need to be showing up as their best selves, because over the last couple of years we've just asked more of managers. Have we taken anything off their plates or created some space for them? And then really putting teeth into performance reviews. If you're not showing up as a good people manager, if you're not fostering inclusion, that should be part of your performance review. The expectation should be that all managers are starting to do those things well.
And if I can add a third to the list, de-average your data. Too many companies pat themselves on the back because they're at 40%, 50% women. They're increasing ground on women of color. But if you look at where that talent sits and how it's distributed across the company, it's all in hotspots. I've got an unbelievably diverse team, but they're all in HR and marketing and this one business unit. That's not diversity in the way you want it, right? And that won't lead to pipelines that are healthy over time. And companies can do a lot more to take the sort of high level story they're looking at in their data and be willing to really dig in and explore it at the granular level, the level that would tell you where's it working for me and where is it not.
Well, thank you so much. I know we're kind of over time, but thank you so much for answering all these questions and for the work you do with the report. I really mean it. It's something I look forward to every year because it's kind of part of me wants hope that things are getting better, but also because it's really enlightening onto just what the future of work should and could be.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And, we were emailing all of us, the big team across Lean In and McKinsey that works on this. We were emailing last night. And it is just, the backstory on this is it's so amazing to see what women can do when we come together, and we collaborate and we bring the best of ourselves. And so we really do put a lot of energy every year into getting this report out into the world. So thank you. We really appreciate that.
Really, it's such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Do you have 2 more minutes for a lightning round or do you need to leave? Because I know we're over time.
Happy to.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
Great. I'm just going to ask you some, because usually we talk a lot about, our guest's story, but we went right into the data.
We
So
love data.
I'm with you
So
here.
we tend to do that. In fact, we often overdo it. So
I am with you on the. It's just fascinating. So it was my fault. I dug deep, like just jumped in, and didn't have time to ask a little bit more about where how you came into this work, because it is, I think, interesting both to understand how this project kind of came to be. Actually, could you answer that? How did this start 8 years ago?
Well, I'll tell my story. I graduated university and my class was diverse. It was full of women, as we've had in this country each of the past 30 years. At least 50% of college graduates have been women. And I entered a workforce where at leadership there wasn't diversity that I expected to see, but I figured we just hadn't arrived yet
Mm.
and that it was a generational thing. And then I progressed, and the further I got, and increasingly as I became part of leadership, I looked around and I said, well, this looks a lot more like 20 years ago than what I thought I was going to find 20 years later. And I started asking people why. And I felt like the answers weren't specific enough. They weren't data driven. They were very anecdotal. And I couldn't figure out how we would change the picture if we didn't actually understand what was going on.
Mm.
And so for me, it coincided with when I was having my third daughter, and I was sitting there going, okay, I've got a generation to fix this. I better get started now. And that was really the driver for me, was wanting to see real change with real speed happening in the workplace and creating the data set that would allow us to do that.
it is so interesting because honestly, we could switch a couple details, and I would I would answer almost the same question almost the very same way. So the one thing that I will add is, when we started this collaboration 8 years ago, I'll speak for myself. I mean, I think the original vision was the power of data to really drive change in organizations, right? We could point to weak spots, we could point to opportunities, we could give data driven recommendations for how companies could move the dial. And we've had some great examples, I think, of us achieving those, kind of bold results. I think, we've seen the broken rung start to close up. It's still broken and that's not okay, but it's closing up. We've
Mhm.
seen companies add new policies and programs, and they've explicitly said it's based on seeing data or findings, in our report. But the one piece of it that I did not expect, that I have just gotten so much from personally, is how many women reach out.
Mm.
And they say a couple things. You hear, I sent the report to a manager, or I sent the report to someone in HR in my organization. Thank you. Like, the report is doing the hard work for me.
Love it.
That's one thing you hear a lot. And the other thing you hear, lots of different words, but the messages you hear, like, I feel seen. Like, I feel validated that my experience is actually supported by big data, and it's not just me saying I'm having this experience. The women in the workplace study is saying that this experience is real and that companies need to address it. So I think that piece of it, that it's not just driving change in organizations, it's actually validating and empowering the women themselves, has been something that over the years, like, I have just like, it gets me up every morning when we're working early, or keeps me up late every night when we're working on this report to get it out, because that type of change feels really meaningful.
I mean, that's so powerful. The being seen is, we sometimes underestimate the power that has in creating, just keeping you going.
Yeah. And helping others see that this experience you're having is not yours alone, right?
Yeah.
It's not you. You said at the beginning, it's not you, it's them.
Yeah.
Right. And giving the confidence that that's the case.
Okay, now I'm going to go to the lightning round. If you could time travel, where's the first place you would go?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to go 20 years in the future to see how much we've fixed.
I like that.
Oh my God, that answer is so good. I was sitting here like, I don't know. I really don't have an answer. I'm going to go with Alexis. 20 years in the future to see how it looks as our daughters are, entering the workplace and what their experience is, and hope that we can really point to changes that maybe we played a little bit of role in.
Love it. Would you rather explore outer space or the bottom of the ocean?
That's easy for me, outer space, hands down.
I'm going to take the ocean floor.
If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
So
I know this.
Oh, you
go ahead. Go ahead, Rachel. Go.
I always joke I'd like to be able to, I call it bleeping. So I'd like to be able to just close my eyes and travel to anywhere in an instant. We call it bleeping in our house, and I would really like to be able to do it.
That's a good one.
I think if I could operate on like 4 hours sleep, then I could be all the different people I aspire to be in one lifetime.
Oof, that just made me tired, Alexis.
No, but I wouldn't be tired. That's the thing.
That's the point.
I'd be refreshed. I might actually run that marathon. Never know. Anything's possible.
Anything is possible. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
The best piece of advice I've ever received was use a filter on all the advice you get. And I love that, because actually when you reflect on it, you get a lot of advice that you go, really? That's what it's going to take? I'm not sure I'm up for that.
I am stealing that. That's great. How about you, Rachel?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like, Alexis, you get a lot of advice as you kind of travel through your career. I think it's a classic, but it really matters. It's just, do what you love, do what you're passionate about, and, put everything you got into it. And then everything, things kind of fall in place for you. And so I've been, at the foundation for 10 years November, and I really do wake up every morning really grateful that I'm doing work that feels like it makes a difference, that feels like a real luxury, and I don't take that for granted.
That's amazing. And 10 years, I've been here 10 years too. I know that feeling. Finally, this is the last one. What's one thought you'd want to leave with our listeners?
Oh, I'll jump in because I think this all the time. So, like Alexis, I came out of university and I just thought the world was a little bit different than it was. Like, I thought we were further along on the journey to gender equity than we were. And then when I started to work at Lean In and started to really get steeped in all the data around women's experiences, there was a moment where the light bulb went off that a lot of this is not about Rachel Thomas as an individual. This is about me and my gender, right? The things I'm taking personally, I shouldn't be. So I want to be able to go around like woman to woman and girl to girl and say to them, it is not you, it is the culture, right? And like, we're working hard to change it, but in the meantime, it is not you, and you just keep doing your thing. So that would be the one thing that I most.
Perhaps similarly, I'd say your difference is your superpower. What we need more of is more variety, more different ways of being leaders, more variability in thought from top to bottom in our organizations. And showing up with difference doesn't mean you need to conform. It means the workplace needs to shift to embrace you.
I love it. I love those sentiments. Thank you so much for Liz and for humoring me with the lightning round. I always think
so much fun.
It was really fun. Alexis' answers were awesome as always. It was great.
Oh, it's such a treat. Thank you for covering this and the conversation.
Oh, thank you.
It's just really great.
Thanks so much for listening to Ellevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Ellevate podcast on iTunes, give us 5 stars, and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at EllevateNTWK, that's Ellevate Network. and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.